This is the reading summary of Ian J. Maddox's 10 Guys You Should Know in the chapter pertaining to Augustine. The chapter makes a familiar reference to the pear, which is familiar imagery for Augustine's, particularly in regard to the confessions. It was said that Augustine had once sneaked into somebody's farm, pear farm, and began to rob them of their pears, not not for reason of lack, but for reason of leisure. He was doing this out of plain mischief as a youth. He would later recall, and I'll probably do a little more quoting because Augustine is a highly quotable church figure. So we'll definitely make some references to his actual words itself. And here in this page, we can see how he spoke about the pleasure that he received not from the past, but in the crime itself, the mischief, enhanced by the companionship of his fellow sinners, which were his friends, of his contemporaries. Why did I find such delight in doing this, which I would not have done alone? Behold, my God, the lively review of my soul's career is laid bare before you. I would not have committed that theft alone. When they say, let's go, let's do it, we are ashamed not to be shameless. Yeah. So this is his quote coming from his book Confessions of his adolescence, rebellion, and his sorrow over sin. Yep. So it was published in AD 397, and he was by that time 43 years old. So he underwent his conversion, which happened in Milan, and then his ordination as a priest, and then as bishop thereafter. And it was him reflecting in his younger years that he penned and he reviewed his youth and penned these words in the book called Confessions. Likewise, another very quotable quote that Augustine has mentioned in that book, very famous quote: "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." Hence, that really set the tone for this chapter as to why the author had kind of subtitled it "The Grace of God Defeated Me." So later on, the author would go on to elaborate a little bit more on Augustine's reflections on grace, what grace really looks like for sinners, the inability of sinners to save themselves, and how Augustine defended such a view of grace, a high view of God's grace in the life of sinners. And so that will be elaborated more on later on. Here we understand that this chapter, whilst it highlights his various oppositions, focuses more acutely upon his fractious debate with British or Scottish theologian monk Pelagius. So who is Pelagius? Later on, we will have a glimpse of that, and not in that much detail, but we will have a look into Augustine's life. And then we will consider his conflicts in views with Pelagius and how Augustine clarified the view of God's grace based on those conflicting points that he made against Pelagius. And of course, that would roll into our view of Reformation, the reformers, including Luther, because Augustine's legacy does famously influence many of the Protestant reformers and other figures within the church history who kind of stood upon the shoulders of Augustine in their reflections. Of course, one of them is famously Martin Luther as well. So we will also consider how his views were also inherited by the likes of Luther and other reformers. Okay, here we come into a chronology of Augustine's life. So he was born 354 in northern Africa of the Roman Empire, considered the backwater places by educated Romans and all of that, which didn't hinder the career of Augustine. The location of Augustine's birth is this place called Tagaste, um, and it's the equivalent of modern day Algeria in a place called Souk Arras. So this was the location of Augustine's birth. It was clear early on that he was a genius, he was destined for greatness. Although he did not come from an overly wealthy family, the family had enough connections to ensure that he had a decent education that would set him up for success. He had a stern non-Christian father, Patricius, who arranged for Augustine to leave his home in Tagaste to attend university in Carthage. Hence, describing the trajectory or journey of Augustine. So Augustine locations, we could consider that as one angle of our understanding of his life. His life began in the location Tagaste, and he relocated to Carthage, right, for his university, and that's modern Tunisia. Say later on, he had brief moments in Rome, and then he went on to uh, Milan. So in this book, Rome was not elaborated upon, but we will consider his movement toward Milan, and then he would go on to relocate to later on to Hippo, and where he became a, a bishop here. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just noteworthy is whereabouts, his movements. Here he was in Carthage where he studied rhetoric. He's an excellent student, curious and intelligent, and way with words and a capacity for hard work. So that really described the character of Augustine, adept, well literate, and diligent as well. He did well in all he did. Following his conversion, God would use Augustine's formidable intellect and prodigious gifting in great ways to serve the church. In his Confessions, Augustine wrote of sin that beset his life as a young man. Confessions is both autobiographical and theological defense of original sin. In other books that I read, Peter Crift perceived Confessions as a book of prayer. So the various it's a very highly rich theological work. It's I would say that it's centrally autobiographical in nature. Theological maybe, but definitely we can see how as well it is as Peter Crift describes Confessions, it is also like a prayer in which we have been graciously invited by Augustine to eavesdrop upon his conversation with God. So he spoke a lot about the pervasiveness of his sin, thoroughgoing pervasiveness of his sin. He was not shy to talk about his sinfulness. He wrote that when he was 16, he surrendered himself entirely to lust, which your God's law forbids, but human hearts are ashamed to sanction. My family made no effort to save me. Their only concern was that I should learn how to make a good speech and how to persuade others by my words. So that was sort of the life and the environment of which he was a part. So we could see that Augustine had a strong view of his sin, that it was apart from the grace of God, he would not have approached God, or he would not have been able to receive the saving grace of God. Okay, moving straight on. So erase this as well. He had a very colorful life. He lived with a woman, his concubine, for nearly 14 years. And the concubine had some rights, and they were not married. Augustine's parents forced him to divorce her, although they had a son together named Adeodatus, which is a gift of God. Yeah. Augustine never named this woman and all of that. But it was notably painful for him when it ended. Augustine's mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. He urged Augustine to get married, and they paired him with a girl from Milan, from a rich family. Had to wait 2 years because she was underage before they could get married. So he took a mistress in between, uh, blah, blah, which definitely highlights the point that he mentioned about the uh, youthful lust and all his struggles with that, giving rise to another famous quote, his famous prayer, "Give me chastity and self-control," but not yet. He was afraid that God would answer this prayer so quickly that he would essentially lose something that he had treasured, he had loved. He didn't want his to be cured so quickly of this disease of lust. He wanted to live. He was comfortable living with it. Um, so this does underscore in Augustine how we have a tendency or inclination towards sin, and how the grace of God is absolutely necessary for our conversion, because if left to our own, for example, we see social pressures in Augustine would not have led him towards God, would not have led him towards righteousness, would not have led him towards sanctification or holiness. It's not a human born desire. It's not through our human born desires that we have any inclination at all to love God, to obey His commandments, and to resist sin. And even in his prayer, it shows his struggle, it shows his desire, it shows his inclination away rather than towards God. He conflicted in a very real sense with himself in his pursuit of God. It was in that midst, though, that Augustine continually realized that he could not find happiness, even though he lived it and reveled in his own sensual pleasures. He continued to have some really questionable relationships, and then in the philosoph in his worldview, he flirted with Neoplatonism, he flirted with Manichaeism, and in the Manichaean view, they believed that the physical world was evil and corrupted, but the spiritual world was pure and good. But what that meant for the Manichaeans was that there was no there's no like real implication in terms of how we live our physical life, because we just uh we just undermine the physical world in favor of the spiritual. However, he conflicted within himself because that of this unbridgeable divide between the spiritual and physical world. They cannot be bridged, it cannot be reconciled. And how can um how can we enter into this high spiritual world while the physical world was dead and broken in that sense? Uh, yeah. So here demonstrates his wrestle between Manichaean views, and then here is with the biblical God and Old Testament. So this was essentially like a struggle in terms of the two different worldviews that he wrestled with. However, he did eventually become disillusioned with the Manichaeans, especially since they didn't have adequate answers for his questions related to evil. In time, he would become one of the most vocal critics of the Manichaeans. After that, he actually traveled to Milan. So here we see from Carthage to Milan. That was in 384. Um, yeah, so he moved there in 384. Why don't we just hyphen that? And he became a professor of rhetoric there. So was a position of relative importance. Yeah. Okay, so this sort of concluded his episode in Carthage. So as in his new role, he actually was in a position of prominence in society, include writing speeches for the Roman emperor. Uh, but more than that, more than the position of significance, was his major conversion experience at age 32. So this was to be a great transformation and turning point of his life. And the person involved in that was also the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, who was a compelling preacher. Augustine initially went to hear Ambrose just to glean some rhetorical strategy, but Ambrose preached on the Old Testament, and Augustine began to be affected. There was that famous garden conversion experience that Augustine had, and this is the quote I'm going to read out. I flung myself down beneath a fig tree and gave away to the tears which now streamed from my eyes. For I felt I was still captive of my sins, and in my misery I kept crying, how long shall I go on? Tomorrow, tomorrow, why not now? Why not make an end of my ugly sins at this moment? I was asking myself these questions, weeping all the while with the most bitter sorrow in my heart, when all at once I heard the sing-song voice of a boy or girl. It repeated the refrain, take it and read. Famously, the phrase called Tolle Lege. So this was his conversion story when he heard the voice of somebody. Augustine took this as God telling him to get a Bible and he read the first passage his eyes fell upon, Romans 13:13. It's an appeal to holy living. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. This clinched it for Augustine. This was his conversion statement. In an instant, as I came to the end of the sentence, it was as though the light of confidence flooded into my heart, and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled. Augustine wrote in his Confessions a poetic prayer devoted to God's gracious pursuit of him. And it's all very poetic. I mean, Augustine was a master of words, right? So he wrote all these words. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient, so new. Late have I loved you, and see, you were within inside me, and I was outside. And out there I sought you, and I, mishappen, chased after the beauty shapes you had made. You were with me, I was not with you. Beautiful things kept me afar, from you. Things which, if not in you, would not be at all. You called and shouted out and shattered my deafness. You flashed, you blazed, and my blindness fled. You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath and panted for you. I tasted you and hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. He was now converted at age 32, in the city of Milan. So, following his conversion, he planned to lead a monastic life, not in ascetic sense. Rather, he retreated to study with his friends, his son and his mother. He was ordained as priest at age 37 in 391. And then he went to find his friend in Hippo. That was when they seized him and made him to be a priest. And he wept because he realized that his dreams of a quiet life were being dashed. Despite the reluctant start, he became a wonderful pastor. In 395, he was ordained Bishop of Hippo and remained there for the rest of his life. When he was about to depart, and in his death in 430, he refused to leave his congregation even though the Gothic tribes were invading his city. He was very down-to-earth preacher and preached to the level of the congregants, even though he could definitely be he could be very academic. He had the ability to be academic, rather. He chose not to. His main opponents were Manichaeans, Donatists, and Pelagius or Pelagians. And we see here all three deny the nature and power of God's grace in different ways. And we shall zero in on his conflicts and his debates with Pelagius and his followers. So he came to be dubbed as the Doctor of Grace because of his in the midst of his conflicts with Pelagius in their debates and in their controversy. So here we see a quick introduction to the background of Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk, some say Scottish. Jerome described him as a huge bloated alpine dog, weighed down with Scottish oats. And he was apparently known to be an obese individual. There was some legitimacy to the context in which Pelagius was advocating for what he advocated. There was moral laxity. So we understand that Constantine, after his conversion, stopped persecuting Christians. Christianity used to be costly. Christians used to be Nero's garden torches and subjects of the lions of the arena. But now, Christians enjoyed an incredible advantages now that they were in favor. What this meant was that nominalism would disrupt the church, and the people could become culturally Christian and be half committed to their faith in Jesus. The cost of Christianity went down significantly, but that means the quality had also went down in the same manner. Pelagius actually emerged in reaction to this. He wanted to reform the church. So he said things like, if it pleases you to be Christian, then perform the works of Christ and adopt the name of Christ deservedly. Or perhaps you do not wish to be a Christian, or just to be called one. However, he does have some dangerous teachings, denying the concept of original sin, teaching that human beings are perfectly capable of obeying God fully. He thought that our wills are free to choose and obey God. Pelagius was particularly inflamed by Augustine asking God to give me the grace to do as as you command and command me to do what you will. So there are some ways in which Augustine really triggered Pelagius. Pelagius hated this kind of a notion because he argued that God would not command something that he knew his people could not keep in and of themselves. In other words, moral ought necessitates moral can. Just because God ought us to do something means that we can on our own do those things. In 414, Pelagius wrote a letter to a young woman called Demetrius, who recently become a nun. Pelagius argued that God would not give commandments people could not keep. So essentially, he said, God has not willed to command anything impossible, for God is righteous and will not condemn anyone for what they could not help, for God is holy. So he has a very strong view of our free will. Our wills are essentially, in Pelagius' term, able and willing to do God's will, and we choose of our own will, whether we obey or we choose to sin. Yeah. So there is and it's fundamentally a difference in the view of original sin. Notably, here it said the idea of free will that Augustine and Pelagius battled over came from differing views of original sin. In Pelagius' view, original sin does not infect and affect us to such an extent that we are morally incapable, whereas in Augustine's view, we are thoroughly incapable apart from God to perform good works. So we will see thereafter what is being elaborated upon between both of these, theological giants. The church so far understood that because Adam and Eve sinned, their children and their children's children for every generation will be born sinful. Humankind was included in Adam and Eve's sin and needed God's grace to save them and to enable them to obey Him. Pelagius instead argued that Adam's sin had no bearing on those who came after him. He was just demonstration of a bad example not to follow, rather than the demonstration of our sinfulness and our sinful condition. So Adam and Eve's offspring were perfectly able to make right moral choices. Hence, Pelagius argued that if people were able to obey God, then they must be able to obey God all the time. And he taught a certain view of perfectionism, meaning that it is possible for Christians to live a life completely without sinning. So Pelagius did have a sort of a view, place for God's grace in his thinking. But whenever he spoke of God's grace, um, it was God giving sort of a prevenient grace, as Arminians would say, setting up the right conditions for us to rightly obey Him. God's grace is evident, for example, in a person's ability to make decisions freely. Pelagius also saw the grace of God as evident in example of Jesus showing us how to obey God, in the enlightenment received at a person's baptism and in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Notice that all these examples of God's grace put the onus on the person to obey God in order to be saved. So it's a way, maybe different interpretation of working out your salvation that Pelagius was arguing for here. In Pelagius's view, God has already um, left us with all the natural capabilities to obey Him, and through that means God gets the glory for our obedience to Him. Pelagius further explains how God alone gets the praise for human obedience. Whenever we say that a person can live without sin, we also give praise to God by our acknowledgement of the power which we have received from Him, who has bestowed such power on us, and there is here no occasion for praising the human agent, since it is God's matter alone. And it's a very familiar argument that is still heard among Armenians. Okay, so what was Augustine's response? Firstly, before going there, we note that what was the church response? So the church took quite long to react to that. Pelagius was arguing for something considered new in his time. So he's saying that Adam and Eve were not did not show that we were born with original sin. It showed that they are a negative example, and we are independent of Adam and Eve, and then God has simply given us the grace to obey Him, and there's a possibility of us living a life firstly of perfection, of not sinning, and pleasing God, and giving God the glory by that by living a life of perfection. Augustine, however, refuted sharply. He wanted to respond cutely. He looked to, of course, he's a pastor, so he definitely has a concern for his members. Um, he saw what was at stake, nothing less than the grace of God. The Bible taught that human beings were indeed sinful from birth, and that God's grace was God's unmerited gift to those who trusted in Jesus for forgiveness of their sin. He referred to John 15:5, and he refuted Pelagius, saying that opponents of the grace of God, without it, as they believe, man can do all the commandments of God. But if this were true, God would evidently have said in vain, or Christ would have evidently said in vain, apart from me, you can do nothing. So he re-emphasizes this grace that Jesus said that, as part of the same commandments or as part of the same words of Jesus, Jesus did emphasize that apart from Him, we cannot obey God at all. Augustine maintained that if a person sinned, it was through inclusion in Adam's sin. Yeah. So it was inclusion in Adam's sin, not because of imitation of Adam's sin as Pelagius taught. Yeah. We identify alongside with Adam in his sin, his guilt and his sin contaminated us, infected us, and was handed down to us. We both came into the world bounded in Adam's sin, and then we ourselves perpetuate the sin as well by committing sin from our free will. Augustine gave three helpful pictures of what original sin looked like and how Jesus rescues us from it. Number one, sin as power which holds us as prisoners. We have bounded wills, and from which we cannot break free by ourselves. We cannot have any liberty to ourselves. Therefore, it is those who are in Christ that are free from the condemnation of sin only. Second, sin as a hereditary disease passed down in each generation, and only Jesus can heal us as our divine doctor. Augustine regarded original sin as a sickness requiring a physician, writing, "Human nature was certainly originally created blameless and without any fault. But the human nature by which each one of us is now born of Adam requires a physician because it's not healthy. Only by God's grace that our sickness can be diagnosed as sin and a cure made available." Through grace. And then there's a third point below. Thirdly, sin is like being found guilty in the courtroom. Jesus brings pardon and forgiveness to this guilt. Okay, so the author brings the chicken and egg argument. The answer is we sin because we are sinners. We are first sinners, so the egg or the first thing to come first is that we are sinners. Therefore, we sin. Pelagius was adamant that human beings had a completely free will to obey God. Augustine argued that our human will is thoroughly incapacitated. We are utterly bound, is the notion that Augustine asserted here. Augustine was convinced that original sin did not negate our genuine responsibility, making very real choices. He likened human beings' wills to a set of balance pans. And when our scales work properly, then weighing up good and evil decisions could be done properly and right moral choices made. However, sin had distorted these scales. A merchant who loaded all his weights on one side of the scale, our decision-making ability has been loaded with the weight on the evil side. Technically, the scales still work, but we lean inevitably towards sin. We sin voluntarily, but also out of necessity. So our wills are bounded in every way. So it's only through God's grace that the scales can work properly again. Only because of God's grace, Christians are able to do what is morally right, which they couldn't have done before in their own strength. Augustine wrote that works proceed from faith and not faith from works. Highly important notion. We do not work our way into the grace of God. Rather, it is the grace of God that causes us to be born again that produces good works. Therefore, it's from Him that we are works of righteousness, from whom comes also faith itself. This is highly important in considering the essence of grace. Grace and works do have sometimes an antithetical relationship. I think the way that we frame grace sometimes is that if we just make people serve more, if we make people Bible study more, they will come into the faith. But in fact, there's no room for that. It has to be a touch of God. It has to be a change that proceed from God first. And then we can begin to obey. Christians will still sin, but Augustine thanked God for the sins that he had not committed. I acknowledge that it was by your grace and mercy that you melted away my sin like ice. I acknowledge too that by your grace I was preserved from whatever sin I did not commit, for there was no knowing what I might have done, since I love evil, even if it served no purpose. Just like the pear stealing incident. Augustine also argued that God's grace is his favor, and as such is freely given. So he believed in the notion of irresistible grace. God irresistibly draws Christian himself. And predestination. God chooses us before we chose him. It's because God chose us, therefore we choose him. Towards the end of his life, Augustine wrote, "In trying to solve this question, I made strenuous efforts on behalf of the preservation of the free choice of the human will, but the grace of God defeated me." He landed firmly in the belief that God's grace is freely given, totally irresistible, and only God's grace can save a sinner and redirect and remake their will to now want to please God. So that concludes the narrative surrounding Augustine and his life. Posthumously, Augustine continues to impact the church world in various ways. Numerous figures such as B.B. Warfield, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was highly impacted by Augustine's On the Spirit and the Letter, written based on 2 Corinthians 3 verse 6, one of his most important writings against Pelagius. This lent Luther some ammunition as he challenged the Roman Catholic Church of his day on issues of grace and justification by faith alone in Christ alone. John Calvin also is theologically indebted to Augustine in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. In observing Augustine's life, we learn that his long journey to Christ testifies to God's relentless grace. So we return once again to this notion. It was the grace that Augustine himself experienced that led him um, to have such a high view of God's grace, and in teaching likewise that as well. Augustine also encourages us as we consider people in our own lives who seem so far away from God. It's never too late to come to Jesus, whatever sins we have committed. Augustine's Christian mother certainly never gave up on her son. Even though from all accounts she was at times overbearing, she prayed very hard for Augustine. As a whole, we can really see what was Augustine's view of grace, one that is highly antithetical to our notion of good works. I think that Augustine isn't utterly anti-good works, but he's anti-good works to the extent that it makes humans think that the good works they do are sufficient in praising God. And two, in a way that good works produces a sort of self-conceited pride, where the only thing that differentiates me and my sinful neighbor is the fact that I'm actually doing this and these things for God, or using my gifts to serve God, and to anchor my salvation, or my the extent of me knowing God to the amount of good works, or the amount of charity that I'm doing. Augustine couldn't produce such a view because he knew that all this time he was dominated by his sinful desires, and apart from the grace of God, which irresistibly drew Augustine to himself, he was an utterly lost sinner. I think in the face of nominalism, Pelagius definitely did emerge to advance his views of free will, and how we and he thinks that we are given uh, complete like free will, and the grace of God is demonstrated in how we exercise our free will. Augustine does not assent to that same view. Rather, instead, he considered the point that Jesus made in John 15:5, that apart from him, we can do nothing, and propounded the view of human sinfulness as heirs of Adam's sin, rather than us as very independent agents on our own, separate from Adam. And all these Bible characters are not just negative examples that in that tell us what not to do, but show us rather like that we are of like condition, and that we are heirs of who perpetuate this kind of sinfulness in ourselves as well, which will also continue to be passed down to our children and the succeeding generations, apart of course from, as the chapter answers it, the grace of God, that defeated Augustine. Hence, a hallmark quote from this chapter, um, where Augustine actually says once again that in trying to solve this question, I made strenuous efforts on behalf of the preservation of the free choice of the human will, but the grace of God defeated me. Yeah. So the grace of God is stronger, uh, and perhaps you would say, may the Lord say to us, as He said to Saint Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you."